See how a typical cycle transpires. And because the wiggles can be confusing, we can simplify it a bit to focus on the pattern of cause-effect relationships that drive the rise and decline of a typical empire. As you can see, better education typically leads to increased innovation and technology development, and with a lag, the establishment of the currency as a reserve currency. You can also see that these forces then declined in a similar order, reinforcing each other's decline. Let's now look at the typical sequence of events going on inside a country that produces these rises and declines. In a nutshell, the big cycle typically begins after a major conflict, often a war, establishes the new leading power and the new world order.
The modern United States is the most powerful country in human history, with over 800 military bases and 37% of global military spending. The US has become the leader of a vast, interconnected global system that has helped usher in an era of unprecedented prosperity and low levels of conflict. To understand America's position in the world, and why it's so pivotal for world politics as we know it, you have to go back to the country's founding, back to when America wasn't a global power in any sense of the word. During the first 70 years of its existence, the United States expanded in both territory and influence in North America, eventually reaching the Pacific Ocean, in a wave of expansionism that resulted in the wholesale slaughter of the indigenous people who populated the continent. But early Americans were deeply divided as to whether the country should expand beyond the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. This became a major debate after the Civil War, when some leaders, like post-war Secretary of State Seward, argued that America should push to become a global power. Seward succeeded in pushing a plan to purchase Alaska from Russia, but his attempts to buy Greenland and Iceland, as well as annexed territory in the Caribbean, were all blocked by Congress. That's because some Americans, including many on Capitol Hill, had a strong anti-imperialist bent. These people worried about America getting more involved in global politics, as well as having to integrate populations from quote-unquote inferior races. And this opposition implied major checks on the imperialist urge to expand. But something was happening in the late 1800s that would change the debate about American expansionism. The Industrial Revolution produced explosive economic growth, and the bigger US economy required a more centralized state and bureaucracy to manage the growing economy. Power became concentrated in the federal government, making it easier for expansionist presidents, like William McKinley, to unilaterally push American influence abroad. The key turning point came in 1898, when President McKinley dragged the country into war with Spain over Cuba, despite some intense domestic opposition. The rising United States easily defeated the moribund Spanish Empire, acquiring Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines in the process. Over the next 2 years, the US would annex the Kingdom of Hawaii, Wake Island, and American Samoa. A few years later, the US took control of the Panama Canal Zone and sent troops to occupy the Dominican Republic. It also purchased the American Virgin Islands. This period of rapid acquisition of far-flung territories put the US on the map as a truly global power. During this time, America also began using its influence to protect its growing commercial and military interests abroad, installing pro-American regimes in places like Nicaragua, and playing a major role in international diplomacy regarding the Western presence in China.
Because no one wants to challenge this power, a period of peace and prosperity typically follows. As people get used to this peace and prosperity, they increasingly bet on it continuing. They borrow money to do that, which eventually leads to a financial bubble. The empire's share of trade grows, and when most transactions are conducted in its currency, it becomes a reserve currency.
And just to be clear, we're not talking about this happening tomorrow. This is going to take some time.
It takes a very long time. So, for example, the U.S. became the largest economy in the world in 1870, just after the Civil War, but it didn't become the global reserve currency until immediately after World War I. So that was a period of 40 to 50 years. So these things move very slowly.
Which leads to even more borrowing. At the same time, this increased prosperity distributes wealth unevenly. So the wealth gap typically grows between the rich haves and the poor have-nots. Eventually, the financial bubble bursts, which leads to the printing of money.
Good afternoon. In support of our goals and in light of the shift in the balance of risks, today the Federal Open Market Committee decided to lower our policy interest rate by a 1/4 percentage point.
Well, then we could see a weaker U.S. dollar.
Yes, certainly the U.S. has this exorbitant privilege, which means a lot of money goes in the U.S. dollar assets. That makes the dollar strong and also keeps interest rates lower. And this new world we envision, where it is going to be more difficult for the U.S. to fund their big deficits, interest rates could be higher, say by 25 to 150 basis points. The U.S. dollar, we think over the long term, will be about 20% cheaper. And then gold, at least during the transition period, will be viewed as an alternative type of reserve currency. And we certainly have seen over the last 10 years a real bid from a number of countries for gold for these reasons until the renminbi is ready in all the different aspects of plumbing to be in a position to challenge the US dollar as the predominant global currency.
An increased internal conflict between the rich and the poor, which leads to some form of revolution to redistribute wealth. This can happen peacefully or as a civil war. While the empire struggles with this internal conflict, its power diminishes relative to external rival powers on the rise. When a new rising power gets strong enough to compete with the dominant power that is having domestic breakdowns, external conflicts, most typically wars, take place.
The last time 3 U.S. aircraft carriers operated at the same time in the Western Pacific, the U.S. was trying to deter North Korea from its nuclear weapons program. The rare incident is now happening again, but this time, USS Nimitz, Theodore Roosevelt, and Ronald Reagan were there because of China.
While the Chinese Communist Party ramps up its disinformation campaign to try to shift blame and burnish its image, we continue to see aggressive behavior by the PLA in the South China Sea.
The PLA has escalated border tensions. We see them today in India, the world's most populous democracy. We watch as it militarizes the South China Sea and illegally claims more territory there, threatening vital sea lanes.
Since 2015, the Chinese regime has built man-made islands, militarizing them with airports, aircraft, and missiles. The area is of great global importance.
Out of these internal and external wars come new winners and losers. Then the winners get together to create the new world order. And the cycle begins again.
Well, I think we are moving into a new world order. I think the Internet of Value, Ripple talks a lot about what payments look like, not just today, but in 10, 20 years. And when we think about that, we talk about this Internet of Value. How do we let value move the way information moves today?
Where we think this new global currency is going to be one with Chinese characteristics. And it's going to look quite different from what the US dollar has been over the last 50 years or before the US dollar when sterling was the global currency.
Be thinking about the structure of the underlying system. And then the third thing, which is much more speculative and longer term, but when you change when you move from one reserve currency to another, look, it's a multipolar world. It would be better to have a multipolar system is the bottom line. Multipolar systems are not sustainable in general in markets, but they are, the nature of payments is such that you can, for certain blocks of the economy, create a multipolar payment system. It's a topic for a whole other discussion. It's hard to get it into a soundbite, but it's that kind of thinking that we need to be doing as the central banks and authorities, in my view.
An example of the working, and it shows us an indication of the coming age that the kind of diplomacy and international politics that we envision in the BRICS is working, that it is workable, that it can create a new kind of world order.
One lesson of the gold standards of Bretton Woods and the current hybrid system is that it is the adjustment mechanism, not the choice of reserve asset, that ultimately matters. In this regard, any greater use of SDRs might be best suited to encouraging a transition from the current hybrid system to a system characterized by more flexible exchange rates for all systemic countries.
Yeah, there's a natural or sort of logical sequence on how a currency starts to get used beyond its borders. And this is really the sequence that the United States followed, say, just over 100 years ago, and the UK did, say, 220 years ago or so. But initially, you start with invoicing. So if you're exporting from China electronics or whatever they're exporting, instead of having it invoiced and settled in dollars, you'd have it settled in renminbi. And we've seen that share that's settled in renminbi go up from roughly 0% a decade ago to about 30% now. So that is something they are doing. And China's having a lot of discussions with countries, not just Russia. Russia clearly is being forced to do this, but also India, Iran, Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, well, the BRIC countries plus a few others. Turkey would be in that group. So more and more countries for more and more goods are interested in invoicing what they import from China and then settling in renminbi rather than euros or US dollars.
My last R is reset. We're seeing as necessary going forward a reset in the area of monetary policies. We believe that quantitative easing and the accommodating monetary policies that have been adopted so far should be continued up until such point where growth is well anchored in those economies, and this is not yet the case everywhere. Reset in the sense that once it is well anchored, then those accommodating monetary policies have to be reformulated, have to move either back into their old territories or be more traditional or be maybe of a different kind, and I'm sure central bankers around here will be able to comment on that, but that's first reset. Second reset is the one that Mark is I hope, going to talk about, which is the financial sector reform and regulatory environment that is clearly undergoing a major reset at the moment. And the final reset, which is my last word, Martin, is those structural reforms that are necessary in all corners of the world. Very often people think structural reforms, okay, for some of those advanced economies that have such rigid labor markets. No, it's not just that. And I'm not sure that I would necessarily associate advanced economies with rigid markets, nor would I mark flexibility as the ideal solution for it. But structural reforms are needed in product markets, service markets, but they're also needed in emerging market economies where structural reforms can take a completely different form from those that I've just mentioned. And they have to do with bottlenecks in certain countries, they have to do with proper governance, and they certainly take multiple forms, including that of unleashing the potential that is there, but that is still constricted by a lot of licensing right, protective barriers, and so on and so forth. I've finished with my 3 Rs, the most important one of the 3 being the one that I've not commented on, but that you have eloquently commented on, which is R for recovery.
But it is the second most used currency, is it not?
Yeah, for invoicing for trade, it's now number 2 to the US dollar and above the euro. And certainly the slope is increasing.
What
customers.
Brad, what do you have to say to that?
Well, I think we are moving into a new world order. I think the Internet of Value, Ripple talks a lot about what payments look like, not just today, but in 10, 20 years.
Well, so when XRP was created, this actually was created before Ripple existed. The creators of XRP decided there'd be 100 billion units because they saw it as rather than having a smaller number with a very high price, they saw it as something they wanted to be effectively a global reserve currency.
The third reason why I'm going to argue we can thrive in this time is we recognize what's going on. This is not a transition, this is a rupture. This is a sharp change in a short period of time, driven by a variety of factors.